Delighted to be here tonight. He is my co-author, my dad, and he's the one that wrestled the tiger of this story by doing a lot of thing on the research for this. He will be available to answer any questions after we kind of work through some of this story. So, Harnessing the Sky, Frederick Trapnell, the U.S. Navy's aviation pioneer. This was published by the Naval Institute Press. Can you all hear me in the back?
Yes.
Naval Institute Press in July of this year. And this is the biography of a man who's been called the godfather of modern naval aviation and the premier test pilot of all time. And yet, very few people know his story. Even people who have been in the thick of naval aviation test flight for many, many years. I want to start by sharing with you something that happened 6 years ago that brought this nearly lost story to light. I was attending a dinner meeting in Ventura County and seated across from an elderly gentleman who seemed to have very little to say until I happened to ask him what had brought him to California. And he began to describe his long career with Grumman Aircraft, beginning in Long Island in 1953, down to Naval Air Station Patuxent River, out to New Mexico, and eventually to Ventura. And I said, well, that's interesting because my grandfather would have been at Grumman, Long Island, the same time you were. Some conversation ensued about my last name being Tibbits, and I said, well, my maiden name is Trapnell. At which point he lit up, leaned halfway across the table and said, what did you say? I said, well, my grandfather was Frederick Trapnell. He said, I knew your grandfather. He picks up his chair, brings it around to my side of the table, sits down, and tells me this story. During his first few weeks on the job at Grumman, they brought in all new desks for the engineers on a big open floor, but they didn't have a new desk for him, so they brought in an old desk out of storage somewhere. A big mahogany, executive-style desk. Just the kind of desk he thought might have belonged to Bob Hall or Roy Grumman. And so he starts cleaning out the paper clips and things that accrue in an old desk drawer, and he gets down to the lower file drawer, pulls it out, and sees underneath a sheaf of papers. He says to me, do you know what it was? It was your grandfather's flight test notes from the Hellcat, the F-6F.
Wow.
Yes, exactly. There's one set of test notes that I'd really like to see from his 10 years in testing. It would be those. And I'm trying to wrap my head around the fact that we're 60 years and a continent removed from John's discovery in the desk drawer, and I'm talking to a guy who held those notes in his hand. He described his dilemma at the time. Can I keep them? Do I need to give them to my boss? He said, I looked up and I saw your grandfather standing there across the floor, and I knew what I had to do. Walked over and said, Admiral, just found these in a desk and thought you might like to have them. He looks at the notes, looks at John, and says, thank you, John. They don't make them like this anymore, do they? Because already the sheaves had grown to volumes. And walks away, notes in hand. So I left the meeting and I called my father and I said, you won't believe the story I just heard. Where do you think those notes could be? Do you suppose they're in the box in San Diego? So the quest for those notes took us to the keeper of the last remaining box of my grandfather's personal possessions, including all of his logbooks, Bill Allen of Allen Airways. He's here tonight with Claudia. He's been a great advocate for this story since before there were advocates for this story. and my dad had given him this box for safekeeping because he has a very fine museum out at Gillespie Field. And so in the course of retrieving the box, Bill said to me, Dana, if you and your father don't tell this story, it will never be told. It will never be told. And I remember the weight of that and the sadness I felt at the idea that the story my grandfather never did tell himself might in fact never be told. Well, we never found the Hellcat notes, but my father and I did begin a 6-year journey to tell his father's story as the Navy's foremost test pilot in a century of naval aviation. So Trap was the legendary aviator who led the Navy from biplanes to jets through one of the most perilous and thrilling periods of aviation history. He spearheaded the Navy's desperate drive, and it was desperate, to modernize its aircraft at the outset of World War II, resulting in 2 critical fighters that we'll talk about in a moment. He became the first Navy pilot to fly the jet, and then following the war, they brought him back to Patuxent River to guide the Navy through the monumental transition to a new jet age. Trapp was born in 1902. He graduated from the Naval Academy at the age of 20, earned his wings in 1927, and joined the Red River's fighter squadron right here in North Island soon thereafter. He very quickly demonstrated uncanny abilities, not only as a superb aviator, but as a diagnostician of airplane behaviors and problems. And because of those abilities, he was transferred in early 1930 to the test section at Anacostia, right across the river from Washington, D.C. The test section was part of the Bureau of Aeronautics, or BUAir as it was called, responsible for the evaluation and procurement of all new Navy aircraft types. This is the entire Naval flight test staff of 1931. Trapp standing on the far right, and he'll usually be the tallest guy in the picture.
Do you know the names of the other people up there?
Let's take a crack at that a little later on. I can't name them all, but I'll bet you he can. Maybe we can
3 out of 5.
Do you want to give it a shot, Dad?
No, that's fine.
Okay, we'll come back to that. Now, Trapp had just made lieutenant, so the opportunity to join this elite group of test pilots was indeed a high honor. Trapp came into flight testing at a very interesting time, when test flight was still in its infancy, when test pilots were more likely to be stuntmen than engineers, when the airplane still played an ancillary and undeveloped role in the fleet. The Navy had still not figured out how to make the airplane the sharp end of its spear, and so it had not come into its own as a weapon of war. There was another important shift going on within flight test at this time, and that was a shift from a highly subjective, qualitative approach to testing to a much more scientific and quantitative approach. So test pilot reports during this era would have said things like, sluggish on takeoff, or she flies swell, or you have to be Charles Atlas to get this one out of a dive. But in order for engineers to make, and officers to make meaningful decisions about airplanes based on airplane performance and flight characteristics, they needed test pilots to fly a complex sequence of maneuvers and then record the numbers. These were numbers like airspeed, rate of climb, roll rate, G's pulled, and stick forces to do it. So the mantra in flight test during this era became, get the numbers. And Trapp became a stickler for getting the numbers. Now it's helpful to remember just how primitive the tools and methodology were at this time. What did you use to measure stick forces in the 30s and the 40s? Well, they used an old-fashioned set of fish scales in conjunction with a retractable measuring tape to measure stick deflection, a pocket stopwatch, a crude panel of instruments, and then the test pilot had to record in real time the numbers, the data points, with a pencil on a knee pad. All the while flying by the one instrument that mattered most, the seat of his pants. And a good test pilot needed a very good seat. Now, lest we forget just how dangerous flying in general and test flying in particular could be in this time, Trapp had 2 bailouts during his career, and that made him a second-degree member of the Caterpillar Club, which is an association of pilots whose lives have been saved by the silk thread of a parachute. Now, his first bailout was from a Boeing F-4B, like this one, and actually rebuilding the F-4B that he bailed out of over Kearney Mesa in November of 1929. And he bailed out because he had a ruptured fuel tank that began acting a lot like a blowtorch between his knees, and he decided it was time to get out and set the entire Kearny Mesa ablaze that day. Here he is, right afterwards, holding the ripcord and D-ring that would have been his entree to the Caterpillar Club. This is a rare photograph. He's smiling. And so his second bailout was out of an airplane at Anacostia. It was a Curtiss prototype, and he put it into a 20,000-foot test dive, and somewhere around 10,000 feet it lost a critical part of its tail section, and he decided it was time to bail out, and this was the rather spectacular wreckage. Now, by the time he made it back to base, there was a crew of eager reporters from Washington, D.C. who couldn't wait to hear all the gory details and wanted to know what went wrong. And true to form, my grandfather said, "Oh, nothing wrong with that airplane until the elevators came off." They wanted his photograph, and he thought that was ridiculous. However, he persuaded them to publish instead a photo of his beloved Irish wolfhound, Wally, who had been missing for 3 days at the time of his bailout. And so here we have the photograph of the pilot with his pup. They were happily reunited the following day as a result of the publicity surrounding Trap's second bailout. Now, Anacostia was not all about test flying. Here is the Navy's very first formal aerobatic team. They were called the Three Flying Fish. They were the earliest precursor to the Blue Angels. They were the Blue Angels of their day. And the Navy picked their 3 best pilots to represent them in air shows across the country, where they did all kinds of stunts and maneuvers that the public had never seen before, including an entire routine from takeoff to landing, both upright and inverted, with their wings tied together by ribbons. The public was fascinated with this new breed of aviator. They really were the rock stars and celebrities of their day. And it's easy to think of them as daredevils, but in reality, they were masters of calculated risk and technical proficiency. So during Trap's 2.5-year tour and flight test, he evaluated more than 60 different airplane types. And his emphasis on getting the numbers was laying the foundation for a new kind of flight test and a new kind of aviator, the engineering test pilot. Trap would become the ultimate working prototype for the engineering test pilot. And his job was to probe the uncharted regions of flight and bring back the numbers that would help engineers modify or redesign the airplane. But his job was also to map out the parameters of safe and stable flight for each and every prototype, and that was called pushing the envelope, which is a term that comes directly out of flight test in the 30s, probably at Anacostia. By the time Trap left Anacostia, his reputation as the preeminent pilot in the test section was sealed, not only with the Navy, but with the American aircraft industry. In July of '32, he was transferred to Naval Air Station Lakehurst, New Jersey, which was home to a grand experiment in naval aviation with the airship dirigibles U.S.S. Akron and Macon. Trap was part of the fighter contingent aboard these airships, and that was comprised of 5 little Sparrowhawk fighters. And here you see 2 of them approaching the airship, and the upper one is headed for the airship Trapeze, which has been lowered to receive the airplanes. So this is how they did takeoff and landings aboard the airship. This trapeze is an interesting piece of hardware to look at up close. Now this is Trap's redesign of an earlier, klutzier, much less efficient version, which irritated him no end. He had to fix it. So this is his redesign, and you see the pilot there focusing on, concentrating on setting his hook on that lower trapeze bar. Once he's latched on, that rear stabilizing arm and saddle drop down over the tail section, and he can be hoisted up into the airship. You might also notice that this is a pretty small airplane for a 6'2" guy like my grandfather. One of his colleagues commented, he didn't climb into that airplane, he pulled it on like a pair of pants. Now, View Air policy during the 1930s was focused primarily on getting a carrier airplane able to deliver a weapon lethal to a capital ship, a big ship. So bombers like these were very much in vogue, but fighters were not. Now, that explains in part how the Navy came to find itself in such dire straits in 1940. This is a picture worth 1,000 words, and it's right from your own backyard. This is the U.S.S. Enterprise, tied up at a quay at North Island, preparing to deploy for maneuvers in the latter part of 1940. Now, if you look up forward, you'll see the fighter department. Look closely. These are biplanes. So believe it or not, the U.S. Navy continued to operate deck loads of biplane fighters right into 1941. Now, new airplanes coming into service at the time, like the Brewster Buffalo and the Grumman Wildcat, were certainly an improvement, but none of these airplanes stood a chance against the kind of fighters that were slugging it out in the skies over Great Britain at the time. Airplanes like the Supermarine Spitfire and the Messerschmitt, they had performance characteristics and gun power the U.S. Navy could only dream about. So, in May of 1940, at the height of the chaos in Europe, View Air called Trapp back to Anacostia as chief of flight test. He had at the time about 3,800 hours in 81 different airplane types, and his job was much like pulling a rabbit out of a hat. By first of all expediting the development of new Navy warplanes, especially a satisfactory fighter, and then shortening the test and approval cycle to get an airplane ready in time for war, which they anticipated to be no more than 12 to 14 months away, and they knew this was going to be an air war. Trapp's early decision to get test pilots into the test and development process much earlier in the game, long before manufacturers could deliver finished prototypes, meant much tighter collaboration between flight test and manufacturing, but it also introduced much higher levels of risk and danger for those test pilots now flying incomplete, unproven machines. So 3 new prototypes made their way to flight test in 1940. Bell put forward this modified Airacobra, the Air Bonita. Grumman offered the Skyrocket, which Trapp later referred to as a twin-engine dodo bird. And Vaught came to the table with the XF-4U Corsair. And after evaluation, they determined that the only one of these airplanes that showed any hope of ever making a carrier fighter was the Corsair. But even after Trapp set the world speed record of 402 miles per hour in this airplane, fastest airplane in the world, he knew and the Navy knew it was never going to make a carrier fighter without radical modification. It had way too many problems. Not enough fuel, not enough guns. It had a sluggish roll with heavy stick loads that would limit maneuverability, essential to any fighter. And it had a nasty trick, a wicked power on stall without warning that was likely to be lethal on landing approach, especially to the inexperienced pilot. So Harnessing the Sky details the little-known backstory of the development of this airplane, which Trapp later remembered as a desperate gamble. But in essence, it came down to a sort of a showdown where Trapp had to go to the drawing board and redraw the airplane the Navy wanted. The wings, the fuselage, the cockpit configuration. And when he and his test pilots took it to Vaught engineers, they hit the roof. Since when did Navy test pilots start redesigning our airplanes? But this kind of tight collaboration between flight test and manufacturers was to become the new normal. So after a painful year-long rework of the Corsair, per Trapp's specifications, Vaught delivered a very fine fighter. And this airplane became the mainstay fighter for the year-long Navy Marine air campaign in the Solomon Islands before making its combat debut as a shipboard fighter in August of 1944, pretty late in the game. Now, during the first year of war in the Pacific, this Japanese fighter emerged as nemesis to American aviators. The Japanese Zero was faster and far more maneuverable than anything in the operational U.S. Navy at the time. After this one was captured off an Alaskan tundra and brought back here to North Island for repairs, Trap came out with one of his test pilots to fly a series of comparative tests, Zero against Corsair, Corsair against Zero. Much to their relief, the Corsair proved superior to the Zero in all flight regimes except low-speed turning radius. This was very good news. They also took the time to devise a series of tactics and evasive maneuvers for Wildcat pilots to use against the Zero, which they did to great effect. Grumman began design work in January of 1941 on this airplane. And Trap, who was a very good friend of Roy Grumman's, stayed very close to this project and nursed it along and consulted with the engineers on a regular basis. So by the time the prototype rolled out in mid-42 and the production model in October, they were pretty sure they had a winner. But what they did not have was the time. They did not have 6 to 8 months to put this airplane through the normal test and approval process with the Navy. So what did Roy Grumman do? He went to Buer and said, look, you need this airplane last week. How about you send Trap up to Bethpage to fly it? If he gives it a full thumbs up, you give us a production contract. Seems reasonable, right? That's how it usually works. So they did. And a week after Trap was flying that Zero we were just looking at, he was back at Bethpage, Roy Grumman helped him suit up for less than 3 hours of test flying in 2 different flights. And he loved this airplane. It was nearly as good as the Corsair and certainly better than the Zero. It was stable, it was easy to fly, and it had no nasty tricks. It was exactly the kind of airplane they were looking for. And Trap later said, if we were going to send 10,000 kids to fight an air war, this was the airplane to put them in. So on the basis of Trap's full thumbs up, this airplane went into full throttle production and made its combat debut in February of 1943. And its resounding success in the Pacific theater is a chapter by itself in naval aviation history. Hellcat pilots took out more than 5,000 enemy fighters, more than half the Navy's total bag for the war. And the interesting footnote on this, I think, is final approval for this airplane did not come through until after the E-Day. Trap's achievement in flight test and development going into World War II, especially with Corsair and Hellcat, stands among the most significant contributions made by any officer of his rank to the American war effort. In April of '43, just before Trap was detached from flight test and sent to war in the Pacific, he received top secret orders to a covert Army airfield in Coronado, California, today Edwards Air Force Base. And there he flew this airplane. And the Bell Era Comet was America's first jet, and Trap became the Navy's first jet pilot. So jets arriving on the scene at the close of World War II offered far greater performance potential than their propeller engine counterparts. But they also posed monumental challenges, not only in terms of the airplanes themselves, but in terms of carriers and carrier operations. They were faster on takeoff and landing, they were heavier, they burned through copious amounts of fuel, they were complex to fly, much more complex than a prop airplane. They were difficult and even dangerous to operate off of carriers. So nothing about jets was routine. And facing a challenge much like their 1940s scramble for fighters, the Navy turned to the same man to help them tackle this new set of challenges. And so in the summer of 1946, Trapp took command of a brand new Naval Air Test Center at Patuxent River, Maryland. This was the real deal. This was a state-of-the-art, comprehensive test center, nothing like Anacostia. And his good friend Arleigh Burke, who later became CNO, said that the reason he was chosen for this job was that he was considered the very best engineering test pilot there was. He set about right away to organize the test program to handle the escalating test load and complexities associated with jets. He also advanced a balanced design philosophy which sought optimum performance without sacrificing any safety, stability, or control. Now that sounds familiar because this was coming out of his earlier work going into the war with the Hellcat and the Corsair. But it became even more important with the advent and complexity of jets. He also mounted a successful 2-year campaign to establish a formal test pilot school at Patuxent River. This was quite a challenge in the post-war budget-constrained Navy, and it took him a good 2 years to get that job done. But this ensured a steady stream of world-class engineering test pilots to guide future generations of jet aircraft through flight test. And so this was a really important thing. And today, the more than 4,000 graduates of the test pilot school include all but a very few of the NASA astronauts. And they are some of the best test pilots in the world. And our book, in fact, is dedicated to them. So Harnessing the Sky describes the triumphs and challenges of this transition to the jet age, including the new and mysterious dangers, that was the test pilot school, including the new and mysterious dangers that lurked for pilots and airplanes now flying routinely at transonic speeds. And as one scholar has said, in the throes of transonic forces, all the engineers' calculations go out the window. In fact, it was so dangerous that Trapp decided that he would fly all preliminary tests of all jet prototypes before even allowing them to come to Patuxent River. There was an article in the Saturday Evening Post of November 48, titled "Jet Buggies Are Tough to Test," and it really pinpoints both the dangers and Trapp's unique abilities to address them. It says, "No wonder Captain Trapnell, ace Navy test pilot, thinks our grandfathers were well off with horses. At sonic speeds, some airplane models snake mysteriously, shockwaves freeze the controls, and a jaywalking turkey buzzard can spell death." Now, of course, the latter refers to what happens if a big bird gets in your jet engine. It's not pretty. He goes on to say, "Captain Trapnell is the foremost test pilot in the Navy. He can detect quirks in experimental airplanes as deftly as a Treasury agent can pick out engraver's mistakes on a counterfeit bill." And that was exactly right. He had this uncanny, intuitive ability to discern things that many pilots had to have the postgraduate training to do. He just understood it. So Trapp supervised the development of the first generation of Navy fighters, beginning with the Fury, which was the first carrier-suitable jet with performance comparable to contemporary advanced jet fighters, and followed closely by the Panther and the Banshee, which represented major advances in jet performance, gun power, and range. Douglas Aircraft built this strange duck of an airplane. This is a transonic research plane. And in August of '47, Trapp flew this airplane to Mach 0.86, closely matching the world speed record set just 3 days earlier by Marion Carl of 150 miles per hour. At the time, this would have been as fast as any pilot had flown in controlled flight. 7 weeks later, Chuck Yeager broke the sound barrier, flying a Bell X-1 to Mach 1.06. In April 1950, Trapp was detached from Patuxent and given command of the U.S.S. Coral Sea, the first aircraft carrier to deploy with jets. This was the end of his flying career, but he spent another 2.5 years in active duty before retiring as Vice Admiral. During his career, he had flown nearly 6,300 hours in 5,000 flights and 162 different airplane types. And the legacy of his 10 years in flight test continues to influence the development of jet airplanes into the 21st century. And perhaps that is why Vice Admiral John Engen, who was chief of the FAA and the designated director of the Smithsonian Air and Space, at the time of his oral interviews in 1994, referred to Trapp as the godfather of modern naval aviation. So the book details his many honors and awards. One of the most significant of these was the naming of the Patuxent River Airfield in his honor in 1976. However, last night we had the privilege of seeing him inducted into the International Air and Space Hall of Fame right here in San Diego, and this feels a lot like home to this story. Thank you so much. What I need to add here is that after he passed away, and I didn't say so, but he came and spent his last years here in San Diego in a house a stone's throw from Gate 2. And I remember the first time visiting there, I believe I was probably 15 years old or so, and walking through the house to the backyard, and the U.S.S. Coral Sea was parked in his backyard, and I thought, that is a very big ship. And truthfully, I had no idea he'd been a test pilot, because the man never said a word about it. So it wasn't until Patuxent River the following year that I began to really hear some of the stories, and I need to get my dad up here so that we can take some of your questions, because I'm sure you have some really good questions. Dad, come on up. So, who's gonna go first? Yes.
Where did you get all this information? Your grandfather didn't talk about it apparently, and it had to be a lot of research to dig all these details out.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Excuse me, my voice is not very good, which is why I relied entirely on my wonderful daughter to give this talk tonight. We did do a lot of research, and if you look in the book, the reference notes in the back, there's about 25 pages of that tell you exactly where we went. Mostly it was the National Archives in College Park, Maryland, which has the old Bureau of Aeronautics files. Now, when you ask for the Bureau of Aeronautics files, they're going to bring a couple of carts about that high, long as that table out, with boxes full of it saying go to it, because they don't have any indexes for that stuff, so you spend a lot of time working your way through all those papers. Also, the Naval History and Heritage Command in Washington has a good set of notes and photographs. The Naval Institute has a good collection of oral histories. He didn't do one, he didn't get one for him, but a lot of his colleagues left oral history. They talked about him, and so that was another source. We went to the Pensacola Museum, we went to NASA Dryden, and those are the kinds of places we spent my time at to dig out the information. Yeah, and all I had was logbooks. I did have a complete set of logbooks.
How long did this take?
Well, we started in 2010. The book was published this year. 1 year of that at least was the delay on the part of the publisher. But other than that, that's how long it took. Yes, it's
Almost a full-time job, huh?
yeah. Well, with the writing and the rewriting and the rewriting and the rewriting. Yes.
My husband would say, "Aren't you done with that? I mean, what are you doing? You've written that chapter 10 times."
somebody else has a question. Bill?
Yeah, I'd just like to make a couple of comments. I'm pretty close to this because
Bill was really put the needle in us to write this book.
well, there's some really cool parallels. Like Putt Stores was, and the Three Flying Fish were involved in the team fly here, and I know that the Coronado Historical Group has some great photographs. The photograph that you showed of him shaking hands after he bailed out of the Boeing F-4B-1 over north of La Jolla there and set the Mesa on fire before breakfast. I found that. Somebody told me there was a cool propeller that was René Fonks, who was a great World War I French aviator. There was a propeller down there in Mission Valley at a little store, a little sale that they were having, a little show. So I go down there and I buy this prop and the karate gear from René Fonk, and I'm looking through these pictures, and I find this picture, and I said, my God, that's my uncle. And so anyway, I conned the guy into loaning me the photograph. And there were two photographs. So when I invited him out to our museum, so the following day he came out, and I said, look, I color copied these, this is really great, thank you very much, and I handed it back. He said, oh no, it's your uncle, you keep the originals. So that's one of the stories. The way I'm sort of connected with the family is Trap was married to June Fry, and my Aunt June lived in Coronado with Trap, and so her husband had passed away on the dance floor at Hotel Del. Uncle Frank had a heart attack. So anyway, Trap and my Aunt June were married in La Valencia down at the veranda there in front of the big window in the 1970s. So I got a naval aviator in the family, which was very cool. And the neatest thing is I have a nephew, my oldest sister, Louise Knowles. Her second son, Jeff, is a test pilot. He was a Navy Top Gun pilot, flying F-14s. He went to Patuxent River after he was in the evaluation squadron at Point Mugu. He went to Empire Test Pilot School in England, went to Pax River to Trapnell Field, was the chief test pilot on taking over the Bombcat, dropping bombs off the F-14 and the auto throttle system for the F-14Ds, joined the Red Rippers, which Trap was in, goes back to Miramar, gets out of the Navy, goes to work for Lockheed, and he was the lead test pilot with John Beasley, the two of them for Lockheed, for 9 years on the development of the F-35. Joint Strike Fighter. He's now at the Skunk Works, and he's a fellow of the Society of Experimental Test Pilots, the same as Trap. So this is just cool stuff.
Anybody else? Oh, come on, you've got to have more questions.
She wants to know about the photograph.
Oh, the photograph, yes, you asked about let me go back to it.
The names.
The names from the flight test staff of 31.
But you remember them a few minutes.
Yeah, you had it. Let's go back.
I'm going to have trouble. You can probably help
It's in the
me.
book.
Do you
Is it not in the
recognize
book?
any?
You have to buy the book.
Can you open the book, Dan? I think they're in there.
Is it in the book?
Oh, they're not in there.
Well, that's good research.
He'll remember them later.
I'll remember.
Yeah, they'll all come to at 2 in the morning.
I'll
Yeah.
call you and tell you.
Yes.
How has your book tour gone, and what reception have you received?
We've had so much fun with this. I'll tell you the truth. I mean, writing the book is a lot of work, and then my greatest fear was that we wouldn't deliver a manuscript that did justice to the man. That would be terrible. And so having done that and having passed muster with some people like Mark Stuckey, who's president of the Society of Experimental Test Pilots, where we spent a wonderful 4 days. Dad presented a paper there. It's a remarkable organization, and they were very receptive, very enthusiastic. This is their story for sure. He was actually one of the first honorary fellows of SETP, and actually the letter in if you read nothing else, you're going to buy the book, but really take a look at his letter in the front of the book, because he was asked to write a biography for them when he was inducted. It's 2 paragraphs. The first sentence is, "I was born naked." That tells you, the man was incorrigible. He would not give it away. So we've been to, go ahead.
Yeah, we went to, I guess the first place we had was the Tailhook Association in Reno. Following that, I was back in Annapolis, at the historical seminar there, presented a paper there. Back to California to Anaheim, the SETP. Then this past week, 1 week or 2 weeks ago, we went back. 2 weeks ago, we were back and had a signing at in the paper at the Naval History Museum in the Navy Yard in Washington. Signings at Quantico, at the Smithsonian, both downtown and at the Haji place, and then spent 2 days at the Patuxent River with the test pilot school and the BX-23, which is the strike test unit there, and then at their museum. Now we're back here. We had a session right here in town in Coronado, across the street at the bookstore the other day, and now here we had the induction last night into the Air and Space Hall of Honor, and we got another signing tomorrow out of the San Diego Air and Space Museum bookstore. So it's going pretty good. A lot of people seem to be interested in it. We've had a lot of good reviews. I haven't heard anybody. You probably wouldn't hear bad things. Maybe you can't hear them. But it's
Something I'd like to add to that is that we've been to some very wonderful Navy, obviously Navy test. It's going to be a sweet spot at SETP. It's a sweet spot at a Tailhook. But you know what? Some of our most enthusiastic groups I felt have been. I was asked to speak at a local. It was the Republican Women's Group in Ventura. The Lions Clubs. The thing is, it's not such a highly technical story that really anybody can enjoy it. And we've had lots of people who are not naval aviators, they're not test pilots, and they read every word of the book and they love it. So that's really been heartening to us because we weren't trying to write a highfalutin book here. We were really trying to write a great story, great biography about an extraordinary man.
And we're very conscious wanting to write a book that you didn't have to be an aviation enthusiast or an aviation or have a deep understanding of aviation. Even though we're going to take you probably a little deeper than you might have expected to go into some of the technicalities that have to do with why did they decide to do it this way? Why did they choose that airplane instead of this one? Give you enough background to understand that, but hopefully we've done it in a way that anybody can follow. And the evidence from people who have read it that I've talked to is that we were particularly successful at that.
We've been told, I want to hear your question, but we've been told that while much has been written about airplanes like the Corsair and the Hellcat, it's mostly about the what and the why and not the who and how. So there's this kind of backstory in this book that isn't anywhere else, and frankly, this is an era in flight test and development about which almost nothing has been written. Even Dick Hallion, who's a scholar in this area, said, this really is a one-of-a-kind book, and it fills a huge void in our own record of aviation history. You had a question, sir?
More of a comment. The gentlemen are named on page 32 in your book.
Oh, they
You
are.
get a free book. It's too late, I already lost it.
Get one for me.
All right, I've got a book for sale. Doesn't name all of them, but it says Trappers on the far right, as you mentioned. His friend, Lieutenant Bob Peary.
Bob Peary, yes.
Is on the far
Thank
left.
you very much.
Robert Peary.
Robert.
Robert here.
And the commanding officer, Lieutenant Commander Ralph Ofsty.
Ofsky, yeah.
Ofsty is in the center.
Yeah.
And then a comment for Susan Keith. Is the stores and the flying fish any relation to you?
Oh, yeah.
Yes, it is.
I'll say.
I was glad to see your picture of Trap with the wolfhound. When my stepfather was back with the flying fish.
Yes, he was.
He had 2 wolfhounds, not just the one.
He had 2 of the Irish wolfhounds.
And then he used to drive to work in his Stutz Bearcat with the 2 wolfhounds.
Oh!
And lived in a small apartment on Connecticut Avenue.
Exactly, I'm sure they both did the same thing, and Trap would
Yeah.
take Wally to
Well, they
work
were
with him.
close
and
friends
he'd
all
hang
their
out.
lives.
Yeah, that's great. Oh, that's great, thank you.
Back there.
Yeah, speaking of Apple stores, and that group was Trap, I guess he got commissioned about 1920 for the Academy. Was he ever in contact with the earlier aviators like Elson and Curtis? Because they were right out here at North Island.
I don't know the answer to your question.
My guess is Apple stores was one of the connections.
Well, if you're at all interested, all of his paperwork and all of his pictures and everything else are right here at the archives at Coronado Historical. Instead of sending them back to Pensacola, I brought them up here. So if you want to come up and look at his papers, I'm sure you can do that.
And your etchings too, right?
Right.
Yes.
How do you bail out of a biplane? Do you go directly out of the cockpit, or do you stand on the lower wing and jump from there? I've always wondered about that.
I look at the airplane, but probably you go directly out of the cockpit.
Okay.
Usually, the cockpits, if you look at most of those airplanes, the cockpits are after the wing. So you're gonna go over the side. So the cockpits on most of those are after the wings, because they put the fuel in front of the cloud.
Yeah. Trim it nose down
Yeah.
if you have a trim.
Okay.
If you have.
Now you go.
Probably maybe,
Yes.
Yeah. Anybody else?
So what did you do, sir? Were you in the Navy?
I spent a couple of years in the Marine Corps at high school. I joined the Marine Reserve Unit here in San Diego 2 weeks before the North Koreans invaded South Korea, and found myself on active duty. That resulted in a 2-year tour as an enlisted aviation electronics technician. And that was my total time in the service. My eyes weren't 20/20 when I was a kid, so I knew I wasn't going to fly, certainly not in the Navy or the military, and I couldn't go to the academy, so I changed my direction pretty early in life and got into an engineering career in computers and software.
Thank you for that service.
I didn't get shot.